For the first 25 days of December, we're going to be doing a readathon for my newest book, Nick. We know this isn't for everyone, so if you don't want us to read you a bedtime story every night, we'll still have our regular vlogs every Tuesday.
But if you do want to come along, then come on!
Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are going to be reading Chapter 9, The Book of Elven Kind. Just behind the golden door was a workshop, and it was filled with many tools and plenty of toys still in the midst of the building process. The walls were encircled by great towering bookshelves, and crammed upon those shelves were hefty books wedged cover to cover. Scattered amongst the books were outrageous toys and sparkling trinkets displayed as they seemed more special than most. In the middle of the room was a working station, a single oak table resting atop 4 griffin legs, where many toys laid unfinished. Mr. McTwizzle closed the door delicately behind them, then spun around to face the orphans as they congregated around the workstation. "Who are you, children?" he demanded, his voice sharp and unexpectedly serious. Nick was taken back by the shopkeeper's sudden abruptness. "We're just orphans." Emma then added, "As we said, we come from Lost Star Orphanage." Gilbert had become distracted by a clock mounted on the wall behind them. It was carefully carved and intricately shaped to model a birdhouse. He played with the hands on the face of the clock when suddenly a tiny door popped open and a mechanical bird came bursting free, whistling. "Brilliant," he noted as he plucked the clock from off the wall, proceeding then to inspect it with a curious glimmer in his eyes. "It's my newest endeavor." Mr. McTwizzle approached Gilbert from behind. "I call it a cuckoo clock. Every time a new hour strikes, the bird releases from inside, chirping to signal the new hour." "It's fantastic," Gilbert went on to further inspect it, "but I would replace the whistle with a shorter metal piece to give it a sharper pitch." Mr. McTwizzle was amused by this. "It sounds to me like we may have a young toy maker within our midst." He took the clock from Gilbert and fixed it back up on the wall. While doing so, in a calm voice he started to talk. "It was the 1st of December, almost a week ago now, when the nun found her way into my shop." He headed back and joined them standing around the table. "She was wandering in an aisle, fascinated by my collection of snow globes, when I noticed that this particular one had caught her interest." He tilted his head, subtly gesturing to the snow globe gripped in Nick's hands. "I remember the moment I saw her, because it was that very moment when I realized what she was." Nick felt the word tingling upon his lips, but couldn't will himself to say the word out loud. Emma took the lead and asked, "An elf?" "That's right," Mr. McTwizzle concurred. "After so many centuries, elves had to learn how to conceal themselves, to blend in with human society, so not to bring unwanted attention their way. But I knew, right when I saw her, that the nun was not what she appeared to be." Nick found himself asking, "How did you know?" "It was her spark, but of course," he answered as though it were common sense. "Her spark?" cried Emma. Mr. McTwizzle plucked off his hat, surprising them all when he showcased his own pair of long, pointy ears. "It's how we elves expel our magic." His eyes twinkled through his shiny spectacles. "I felt the nun spark the very instant she stepped into my shop, pulling me in like a magnetic force." Gilbert strained to look up at the shopkeeper, all whilst fixing his glasses comfortably on his nose. You're an elf?" "That's right," he patted the boy softly on the head. "When I approached the nun, I asked her what had brought her in. She informed me that she was searching for a Christmas gift for a boy she looked after who had yet to understand how special he was. And so she chose that particular snow globe." His gaze shifted across the room and settled on Nick, who was left to feel slightly vulnerable in the intensity of his stare. "I take it you're that boy." "Me?" spluttered Nick. "No, I'm afraid you're mistaken. I'm just an orphan." Mr. McTwizzle lifted a brow while grinning mysteriously. "It would seem that is still to be determined." Emma swept into the conversation, during which the shopkeeper never strayed his attention from Nick. "Are you telling us that the world is filled with elves, and they all have magic?" "Young lady, that is precisely what I'm saying." "I'm no lady," mumbled Emma. She then squinted at the toy maker. "I'm no lady," mumbled Emma. She then squinted at the toy maker. "Well, if you're an elf, then tell us, how do we know you aren't like the ones who kidnapped the children at our orphanage?" Mr. McTwizzle stepped back. "Kidnapped? What do you mean? Mr. McTwizzle stepped back. Kidnapped? What do you mean? Before Nick could build up the courage to respond, Emma continued, undetermined by Mr. McTwizzle's surprise. A group of so-called elves took all the children from our orphanage, Emma stated sharply. Taken back by what she had just stated, Mr. McTwizzle continued on to say, elves can either be good or evil in nature. It all depends on how we use our magic. Mr. McTwizzle stretched his arms across the table, hovering them over a small wooden train which sat beside a pile of wheels that had yet to be installed. He wiggled his fingers, and the wheels rose into the air. They spun around the train on a whirl of wind, and then they popped into the train and fixed themselves perfectly in place, seemingly of their own accord. The train then came to life, whistling away as its wheels began to spin, and puffy white clouds came belching out of its smokestack. Mr. McTwizzle then flicked his wrist, and the train went streaming through the air on a glimmering golden track that materialized as it went. Wow, the children marveled as the train whisked up over their shoulders and circled around above their heads. How are you doing that? Their voices synchronized as they awed over this spectacular display. Magic, Mr. McTwizzle informed with a twinkle in his eyes. Gilbert watched the train circling from up above. But how does it work? Allow me to explain. Mr. McTwizzle snapped his fingers, and instantly the train came diving back down, before softly landing upon the table where it came undone again. You see, magic is just as real as the air we breathe. It's everywhere. He lifted his arms as he scoured the room, seeming to embrace a force that none of the children could see. You can't see it, but you can feel it. And we elves are gifted in the art of bending it to our will. He went on to educate. Elves can manipulate magic, but we cannot create it. That is something only children can do. Children? Nick inquired, growing more curious by the shopkeeper's every word. But how do children have anything to do with magic? Everything, my boy, for it is children who are the most magical beings of all. Mr. McTwizzle furthered his explanation. Magic is the manifestation of a feeling, but more specifically, the feeling released by a human child. A child's laugh, an act of kindness, a smile to a perfect stranger. These all bring forth joyful feelings that are released into the air, creating an invisible substance that lingers forever. Children are what create magic, and elves are creatures that can tap into that magic and perform all sorts of incredible wonders. Nick found himself even more intrigued. But how can an elf perform magic? All it takes is a spark. He began to pace the room, during which all the toys along the shelves came to life. An elf must find what makes them special, and what that is becomes their spark, and that spark is connected to the magic in the air. He picked up a porcelain swan from off a shelf. My spark has always been imagination, and so I see things in the world that others can't, and now create something out of nothing. He looked into the eyes of the porcelain swan. It started to crack, and that crack soon grew into a network of fissures until finally it broke into pieces. A real swan emerged out of its porcelain shell like a duckling breaking free from an egg. Mr. McTwizzle stroked the bird. Humans and elves must work together, because it is only together that magic can exist and even be seen. He released the swan, and it went soaring across the room. It circled Nick, then flapped its wings as it glided over Emma, then landed on top of Gilbert's curly head. The magic that fills this room stems from the wonder you three are feeling at this very moment. I'm able to tap into it. I feel a vibration in my heart and release it with my spark. With it, I'm able to achieve impossible things. That's what magic is, and that is how it works. Brilliant, Gilbert looked up, his glasses lopsided, and giggled when he found the swan nestled on his head. Absolutely brilliant. Nick wasn't nearly as amused as his friends were. Then why would elves break into our orphanage and kidnap all the children? He felt his muscles tightening and his jaw becoming heavier. They murdered Sister Merriweather. Shocked by Nick's comments, Mr. McTwizzle continues. Elves can either be good or evil. It's always up to the individual to choose a path. Mr. McTwizzle scooped the swan off Gilbert's head and then shelved it back where he had found it. It then hardened back into solid porcelain. The toy maker then scanned a row of books until he spotted the one he had sought to find. He drew it free, then returned to the children where he placed the novel down on the table. It was a very old book, Nick noticed, as the book was bound by worn leather and packed with frail pages. It was so ancient that Nick had to squint his eyes just to read the title engraved across the cover that had been written long ago in a fanciful scribe. It read, "The Book of Elven Kind." Mr. McTwizzle noticed their interest as each of the children held a fascinated gaze with the book. "If I could just borrow a moment of your time, I would like to share with you all a story that no human has ever heard before." He flipped open the book, conjuring a cloud of dust to pollinate the air. It wasn't until the dust settled that they were able to see the first page of the book, where a hand-painted sketch was illustrated of a most hideous-looking creature. He was simply terrifying, so much so that it left each of the children with an icy chill to prickle up their spines. The creature was tall, yet hunched, and he had a pair of jagged horns that twisted out from his bulging forehead. His eyes were just as red as the scars on his snout, and that snout was filled with sharp, snaggled teeth. He was wrapped in an emerald cloak and had a long silver beard that tumbled down to his hooves. Mr. McTwizzle began, "This story begins 1,000 years ago, in a time when humans and elves lived freely amongst each other." He went on, holding the children captive with his every word. "Magic was alive and well, created by the children of the world and enjoyed by all of elven kind. It was a time when humans would rejoice in the audience of elves, and elves were honored in the highest regard. In these times, children were joyful and happy, and so an elf's magic was incredibly gifted. It could flourish crops and build great cities. Why, it could even cure the ill suffering on the brink of death. Humans and elves lived in perfect harmony, that is, until this creature came to be." Mr. McTwizzle tapped the illustration with his index finger. "His name was Krampus," he informed with a shiver in his voice. All the toys throughout the workshop suddenly beeped and buzzed as they too were frightened by the name. "He was a dark and menacing being, Mr. McTwizzle's joyful tone dwindled like a flame in the rain. He believed that magic was strongest not from a child's joy, but when birthed from a child's fear, and so he sought out to frighten young children and to feed off their nightmares and fears. The more he fed, the more deformed he became, until one day he transformed into the very terror that he inflicted." "He became a monster," said Nick, with eyes trained on the hideous illustration. "Yes," the toy maker agreed, "but there's something you must understand." He then went on to paint a clearer picture. "Magic spawned from a child's fear is unlike magic birthed from a child's joy. It's more powerful, yes, but it's dark power. The thing about darkness is that people often become lost in it. This is exactly what happened to Krampus. He had fed off the fears of children to the point of no return. He became something different, something dark, something soulless, something that could never be destroyed. What Krampus became was the face of darkness, the physical manifestation of evil itself. He didn't just become a monster, he became the king of monsters." Nick glanced over his shoulder. He knew it was silly, but he had to be certain that Krampus wasn't hiding in the shadows behind him. "What happened to Krampus?" asked Emma. "For many years the world fell into a dark age, and it was all because of Krampus. The fear this monster brought to the world was unmanageable, and it was spread throughout the globe. Children began to change. They lost their joy, and when there is no joy, there is no wonder or hope, only darkness." Mr. McTwizzle's spirits suddenly uplifted, but a day would come when the reign of Krampus would end. He stopped to leaf through the crisp pages of the book, ending at a page where a new illustration was sketched and hand-painted. This one too was beautifully drawn, but of a young handsome elf with light blue eyes and long dark hair. His name was Saint Nikolai CLAUS, and he was bestowed with the title of saint after he defeated the king of monsters. Mr. McTwizzle dove deeper into the story. Nikolai was a wise, kind-hearted elf who believed that elves were gifted with magic so that they may protect the children of the world. So he sought to find Krampus, journeying far and wide until he ventured into the coldest, darkest region on the face of the planet, to an icy land called the North Pole. Nikolai found Krampus hidden deep in a cavern known as Twilight Bridge. At this point, Krampus was more powerful than beyond measure, and to defeat him, Nikolai had to sacrifice himself. Even by using all the joyful magic left in the world, which at the time wasn't a lot at all, Nikolai couldn't destroy Krampus. But he was able to trap him in the cavern, entombing him forever in a grave of coal. Mr. McTwizzle lost himself in the moment, his eyes dimmed in sorrow. I'm afraid to say that Nikolai was never seen again, but something was found in the site of their battle. His eyes suddenly brightened. It was a rare ruby gem. A ruby gem, the three children chorused. When Saint Nikolai and Krampus battled, magic and darkness collided, and the impact crystallized into a most spectacular stone. That stone was found years later in a blizzard just outside of Twilight Bridge, shimmering in the snow like the dawning of the morning sun. Nick felt himself captivated and wanting to know more. Who found the stone? It was Nikolai's daughter, Mr. McTwizzle answered. She was the one to have found it, and with it she built what she called the Northern Staff. It was with this staff that she was able to finish her father's work, restoring joy to the world. This staff is the most powerful object in all of the world because the ruby inside it is able to absorb the joy of children from all over the world. An elf's magic is merely a parlor trick when compared to that of the Northern Staff, he went on, to ensure that the gates of Twilight Bridge would never be opened, and so that Krampus would be forever locked behind it. Nikolai's daughter built a village near the site. She called it CLAUS Village, named after her family's surname. The village has since become an elven home, offering sanctuary to all who seek it. As for the Northern Staff, it has been handed down the CLAUS family line for many generations. The current wielder bestowed with the responsibility of ruler of all of elvenkind. Emma cut into this history lesson. That's a nice story and all, but Krampus is gone, and the elf who took the children from our orphanage was called something else. Lord Alvamork, Mr. McTwizzle announced gravely. He is an elf who shares the same beliefs as Krampus once had. That children should not be joyful, but fearful, and darkness should be spread throughout the lands. The toy maker eyed Nick. 15 years ago, Alvamork broke into CLAUS Village and murdered the ruler of elvenkind, the last of the descendants of Saint Nikolai. He then took the Northern Staff for himself, but the stone was missing. Nick pepped up, as if he had just taken a shot of espresso. Missing? As I've said, the Northern Staff is the most powerful object on the face of the planet. But it's not the staff itself, but the stone within. 15 years ago, that stone was stolen. His eyes narrowed on Nick. If you are the boy Sister Merryweather was referring to that morning she came into my shop searching for a Christmas gift, then I conclude Lord Alvamork is looking for something or someone, and I would guess that has something to do with you. He believes you have something to do with the stolen stone. Me, spluttered Nick. Why would Alvamork think I have it? Emma was just as perplexed as he was. That doesn't make any sense. Nick's just an orphan. What would an orphan be doing with an object like that? Mr. McTwizzle held his gaze with Nick. Who knows? I guess only time will tell. It's just a mistake, countered Nick. I have nothing to do with any of this. What matters is bringing the children back, and we now know where they could be. He placed the snow globe down on the table, all eyes shifting to the glass dome where the frosted village whirled with snow. That's where they are, he exclaimed. CLAUS Village. CLAUS Village, Gilbert echoed. You mean the North Pole? How exactly do you expect 3 children to get to the North Pole? It doesn't matter, Nick said stern and bravely. The sooner we leave, the sooner we can rescue them. You'll need this, Mr. McTwizzle thumbed through the remaining pages of the old novel, stopping at the very last page where a folded up piece of parchment had been left tucked away. He plucked it out and then handed it over to Emma. I think this is safer with you. Emma took the parchment and unfolded it. Nick and Gilbert huddled around her as they all viewed an ancient map. It seemed no more than an ordinary map at first, but then painted versions of the children suddenly materialized upon the page in a spot marked as New York City. As for you, my fellow tour maker, Mr. McTwizzle turned to his bookshelf, where he retrieved a jingling pouch. He dropped the sack into Gilbert's opened hands. Gilbert peeled it open and peeked inside. It was filled with golden bells tinkling away with subtle movement. Each of the bells glowed a golden light that radiated from within each of them. What are they? I call them cracker bells, Mr. McTwizzle then explained. They are elven made and, I proudly admit, are crafted from my own design. Each of the bells contains a single drop of magic that can be recharged only by the same method to which magic is created, the joy of children. He tapped the side of his nose. Just remember, the 3 rules of magic that shall not be broken without repercussions. Number 1, he began to list off on his fingers, magic cannot create food. Number 2, wounds can be mended, but death is permanent. And number 3, magic obtained from a child's fear will leave you scarred and disfigured. Got it, said Gilbert, already itching to learn how exactly the cracker bells worked. Now you, Mr. McTwizzle, approached Nick. I don't have a special object for you that may assist you along on your quest, but what I do have to offer you is a bit of advice. Believe, he poked Nick firmly in the chest. Others will believe in you only after you learn to believe in yourself. Oh, thank you, sir. Nick tried to be polite, as he prided himself on always being, but he would have much preferred the cracker bells than Mr. McTwizzle's mysterious advice. Nick stuffed his snow globe back into Gilbert's satchel before the 3 of them gathered in front of the golden door. Emma had just seized hold of the knob when Mr. McTwizzle stopped them. Take this with you as well, he handed Emma the old novel. There are stories in this book that you might find useful, he then locked eyes with Nick. Whether you have the stone or not, it doesn't matter, because Avramark believes you do. He'll stop at nothing to find it. If he does, he will be able to wield the northern staff to conquer the world, and darkness will rise once again. I understand, but I don't have it, Nick assured the toy maker. Honestly, I don't. On that note, the orphans headed back through the toy shop, returning to the bustling streets of New York City. Each of them was fully aware that their journey was only beginning. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed chapter 9. Come back tomorrow for chapter 10, Cracker Bells.